On the 4th of July, 2026, as fireworks were being prepped over the National Mall to celebrate 250 years of American independence, paramedics were already running, not toward an explosion, not toward a shooting, toward heat. Nearly 300 people would need medical attention that single day in Washington, D.C. alone, collapsing in a heat index that had crossed 110 degrees. Dozens were carried out on stretchers. And a few miles away, in Pennsylvania, a 68-year-old man died trimming his hedges in his own backyard. No storm, no siren. No warning that made the evening news the way a hurricane would. Just heat, quietly stopping a heart that could no longer keep up. By the time the holiday weekend was over, at least 25 Americans were dead. New Jersey alone counted 22 fatalities spread across 10 counties. And here's the detail almost no one was told. Heat kills more people in the United States every single year than hurricanes, tornadoes, and lightning combined. Not close, not some years. Every year. And yet, when you turn on the news during a heat wave, there are no urgent bulletins interrupting programming, no evacuation orders, no images of flattened houses. Heat is the disaster that never looks like one. And that, as you're about to discover, might be the most dangerous thing about it. Because on paper, in the official language of the United States government, extreme heat is not classified as a major disaster at all. And let that sit for a moment. Under the federal law that governs emergency response in America, the Stafford Act, hurricanes qualify, wildfires qualify, floods, earthquakes, tornadoes, all qualify. Heat does not, which means that when a heat dome kills more Americans in a week than a mid-sized hurricane, the Federal Emergency Management Agency has no statutory authority to declare it a disaster, no automatic funding trigger, no coordinated national response mechanism built for it. The deadliest weather phenomenon in the country is, bureaucratically speaking, invisible. This is the story of how that invisibility is now colliding with a physical reality that is changing faster than almost anyone in Washington wants to admit. This is the story of America's heat crisis. Not some distant future threat, but something already reshaping power grids, hospitals, farms, transportation systems, and the human body itself, right now in real time. And by the end of this story, you'll understand something unsettling. The crisis isn't really about how hot it's getting. It's about how unprepared the systems protecting you were ever built to be. Start with the numbers, because the numbers alone should stop you cold. Between 1999 and 2023, heat-related deaths in the United States nearly doubled, climbing from just over 1,000 a year to well over 2,000 annually, according to a 2024 analysis published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The worst year on record in that stretch was the most recent one measured, 2023, meaning the trend line isn't flattening, it's accelerating. And researchers who study this openly admit the real number is almost certainly higher, because heat rarely gets listed as the official cause of death. It hides behind heart attacks, strokes, kidney failure, respiratory collapse. The coroner in Pennsylvania, who examined that 68-year-old man's death, didn't write heat wave on the certificate. He wrote heart attack brought on by heat exhaustion. Multiply that pattern across thousands of cases every year in every state. And you start to understand the undercount problem that haunts every official heat statistic in America. The crisis is bigger than the headlines, because the headlines are working from incomplete data. Now overlay the economics, because this is where the story stops being just about individual tragedy and starts becoming a systemic threat. Extreme heat costs the United States economy roughly $160 billion a year. Lost labor productivity from outdoor workers who can't safely work, healthcare costs from the emergency rooms filling up, crop losses from fields scorched before harvest, energy, systems straining under air conditioning demand, and infrastructure literally warping under the sun, roads buckling, rail tracks bending, equipment failing. That figure places heat in the same economic damage category as a major hurricane season, except unlike a hurricane season, there's no telethon for it. No FEMA trailers, no National Day of Mourning, just a slow, compounding drain that barely register as news because it doesn't produce a single dramatic image, just an accumulation of quiet, forgettable ones. So how did we get here? To understand that, you have to understand what a heat dome actually is, and why the summer of 2026 became the moment this slow-building crisis finally broke into full public view. A heat dome forms when a massive ridge of high pressure parks itself over a region and simply refuses to move. Think of it as an atmospheric lid, clamping down over hundreds of millions of people, trapping hot air beneath it for days, sometimes weeks. Heat that would normally rise and disperse instead gets pressed back down toward the earth, compounding day after day until the ground itself is radiating stored heat back into the air at night. That's the mechanism. But the reason it's becoming so much more dangerous is layered with something scientists have spent decades warning about, and something almost no one wants to say out loud in an election year. Human-caused warming from fossil fuel emissions doesn't just make hot days a little hotter, it makes the entire pattern more frequent, more prolonged, and most critically, it prevents the one thing the human body desperately needs to survive extreme heat: a cool night. Here's the detail that should genuinely frighten you because it explains why the deadliest heat waves in American history are almost never the hottest ones on a thermometer. In 1995, a heat wave settled over Chicago. The peak temperature recorded 106 degrees at Midway Airport wouldn't even rank among the 50 hottest readings ever logged in Arizona or Texas. And yet, in 5 days, it killed 739 people. Why? Because the overnight lows never dropped out of the upper 70s. The human cardiovascular system needs the night to reset, heart rate to slow, core temperature to drop, the accumulated stress of the day to drain away. When the night offers no relief, the body simply keeps compounding stress on stress, hour after hour, until for the most vulnerable, the elderly, the very young, people with heart conditions, people without air conditioning, the system fails entirely. Now look at what happened across the eastern United States in late June and early July of 2026, and you'll see that same mechanism playing out on a scale that stunned even veteran meteorologists. In La Crosse, Wisconsin, the overnight low on June 30th dropped only to 81 degrees, tying the city's warmest night ever recorded in a data record stretching back to 1872. In Caribou, Maine of all places, the overnight low only fell to 71 degrees, matching an all-time record that had only been touched a handful of times since 1939. Think about that. Maine, a state famous for cold winters, recording a night so warm it rivaled anything in over 80 years of measurement. This is what climate scientists mean when they say the fingerprint of a warming planet shows up first, and most clearly not in the daytime highs everyone talks about, but in the nights that no longer cool down. The daytime numbers were staggering enough on their own. More than 1,500 daily high temperature records were tied or broken across the country in June alone. Atlantic City, New Jersey, hit 106 degrees on July 4th, shattering its all-time record. Washington, D.C. reached 102, breaking a record that had stood since 1872, since the same era, remarkable as it sounds, as some of those overnight low records in the upper Midwest. Philadelphia logged 3 consecutive days above 101 degrees for the first time in its recorded history. And this wasn't confined to one region. As the Eastern Heat Dome finally broke apart in early July under a wave of violent thunderstorms, storms so intense they knocked out power to over 1 million homes and produced Connecticut's largest hailstone on record. A second heat dome was already forming over the western half of the country, pushing Phoenix to 113 degrees and threatening highs, approaching 117 in the days that followed. More than 200 million Americans, roughly 2/3 of the entire country, found themselves under some level of heat alert during that stretch. 200 million people. For context, that is more people than were affected by any hurricane in American history, by an order of magnitude. And it happened with almost no advance narrative. Preparation, no hurricane-style tracking maps dominating cable news for a week in advance, because heat doesn't spin on radar the way a storm does. It just arrives and stays and grinds. But here's where the story takes its first real turn, because the heat wasn't just a public health emergency. It was becoming an infrastructure emergency, and the infrastructure in question was one most Americans never think about until the moment it fails: the power grid. As temperatures surged, so did electricity demand, because when it's 110 degrees outside, air conditioning stops, being a comfort and becomes a literal survival tool. The nation's largest regional grid operator, PJM Interconnection, which supplies power to 65 million people across 13 states and Washington, D.C., forecast electricity demand of 166 gigawatts, poised to break a summer peak record that had stood since 2006. The U.S. Secretary of Energy took the extraordinary step of issuing a formal energy emergency alert, ordering every available power plant back online at full capacity, with no room for scheduled maintenance, no margin for error. Wholesale electricity prices, the rate utilities themselves pay for power in real time, spiked from under $40 per megawatt hour to over $1,600 per megawatt hour in a matter of hours, a 40-fold surge that signals a grid pushed to the absolute edge of its capacity. And here's the twist almost nobody was talking about at the time, the detail that reframes the entire crisis. The grid wasn't just straining from air conditioners, it was straining from something newer, hungrier, and largely invisible to the public: artificial intelligence. Since 2023, the AI boom has triggered an explosion in data center construction across the United States, with more than 1,500 new facilities currently in development nationwide. Virginia, one of the states forecast to face the highest temperatures in this very heat wave, already hosts over 600 data centers. the highest concentration in the country, each one consuming staggering amounts of electricity and water simply to keep servers from overheating. So at the exact moment when extreme heat was pushing tens of millions of households to crank their air conditioning to survive, the same power grid was also being asked to feed a rapidly multiplying army of machines that never sleep, never stop, and never care what the temperature is outside. Two invisible crises converging on the same aging wires at the same moment. City leaders felt the squeeze immediately. In New York, officials pleaded with residents and businesses to set thermostats to 8 degrees, to delay running major appliances until evening, simply to keep the lights on for hospitals and vulnerable residents. Con Edison, the utility serving the city, reported tens of thousands of customers losing power in the Bronx and Queens as the system buckled under combined heat and demand. Voltage reductions, a technique utilities use to prevent a full collapse by deliberately dimming the grid, were implemented across Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Westchester. This is what a grid on the edge of failure looks like from the inside. Not a single dramatic blackout, but 1,000 small, deliberate dimmings, each one a sign that the system's margin for error had nearly vanished. Meanwhile, in hospitals across the Midwest and Northeast, a second, quieter emergency was unfolding. The CDC's Heat and Health Tracker, a real-time surveillance system built specifically to monitor heat-related emergency room visits, recorded numbers that stunned public health officials. In the region covering Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, the tracker's index rocketed from 183 to over 1,500 in just 4 days. In the Mid-Atlantic, it rose from 72 to over 1,100. In New York City specifically, heat-related emergency room visits jumped from just 2 on June 27th to 43 by July 1st, the highest single-day total of the year. Every one of those numbers represents a person whose body reached a breaking point severe enough to require emergency medical intervention. And CDC officials, using their own clinical language, described the rate of heat illness across the Northeast that week as extremely high, a phrase public health agencies do not use lightly. Public infrastructure buckled in ways both literal and symbolic. Rail lines across the Northeast and Midwest, Amtrak, SEPTA in Philadelphia, New Jersey Transit, were forced to slow trains or cancel service entirely because steel rails expand and warp in extreme heat, risking derailment. Parades, meant to celebrate the 250th anniversary of American independence, were canceled outright in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., as extreme heat made it unsafe for marching bands, veterans, and spectators to gather outdoors. Even the nation's ongoing hosting of World Cup matches that summer became a heat management operation, with health officials scrambling to protect players and fans as heat indices at East Coast stadiums climbed into the low hundreds. And through all of it, the deaths kept accumulating in the background, reported almost as footnotes beneath the bigger headlines about grid strain and canceled fireworks. 25 confirmed by the holiday weekend's end. Likely far more never formally counted as heat deaths at all, hidden inside heart attack statistics, hidden inside stroke statistics, hidden inside a system that, as we've already established, doesn't even classify extreme heat as an official disaster in the first place. This is the moment to step back and ask the question this entire documentary has been building toward. Is 2026 an outlier, a freak convergence of bad luck and bad timing, or is it a preview? The data says preview. Climate researchers have documented that the frequency of extreme urban heat events in America has roughly quintupled since the 1960s, rising from an average of about 2 per year in that decade to roughly 10 per year over the past 15 years. The average heat wave season itself, the calendar window in which dangerous heat events occur, has stretched by 46 days since the 1960s, nearly a month and a half longer than it used to be. This isn't a single bad summer. It's a structural shift in the baseline climate that every American city, every hospital system, every power grid, and every piece of aging infrastructure was built decades before anyone anticipated needing to survive. And the grid vulnerability is not improving on its own, it's compounding. Research analyzing weather-related power outages across the eastern United States between 2000 and 2023 found that heat-driven outage events have already increased by a factor of somewhere between 1.6 and nearly 6-fold, depending on the region. And the same research projects that outages will keep multiplying exponentially as heat wave frequency increases. Or unless grid infrastructure is specifically hardened for heat resilience, something that, as of 2026, has not happened at anywhere near the pace required. And remember what a power outage during a heat wave actually means for a human being trapped inside it. The one thing standing between a vulnerable person and heat stroke, air conditioning, vanishes at the exact moment it's needed most. A blackout during a blizzard is dangerous. A blackout during a heat dome, especially overnight, can be this is where the reversal in this story becomes impossible to ignore. For decades, the dominant image of climate danger in the American imagination has been a hurricane. bearing down on a coastline, or a wildfire racing through a forest, or floodwaters rising around a city. Those are the disasters with dramatic footage, official warnings, presidential disaster declarations, and national attention. Heat has none of that visual language. It doesn't make landfall. It doesn't have an eye you can track on satellite. It simply settles invisibly over hundreds of millions of people at once, and it kills quietly one vulnerable body at a time in ways that rarely make the cause of death certificate. The Federation of American Scientists, in a formal policy proposal delivered to Congress, has explicitly called for heat to be added to the Stafford Act's list of qualifying disasters, and for FEMA to develop dedicated heat hazard mitigation guidance. As of the summer of 2026, those recommendations remain unimplemented. The deadliest weather phenomenon in America remains the one the federal disaster response system is least equipped and least authorized to fight. So what happens next? Because this is not a story that ends with a single summer. Expect the heat dome pattern that defined 2026 to repeat and likely intensify as long as the underlying drivers, a warming atmosphere layered on top of natural patterns like El Niño, continue reinforcing each other. Expect power grid operators to face the same brutal math every summer: rising air, conditioning demand from a hotter climate, colliding with rising electricity demand from an exploding population of energy-hungry data centers, all running through transmission infrastructure that, in many cases, is decades old. Expect emergency rooms to keep absorbing the overflow quietly, without the kind of coordinated federal disaster response that hurricanes automatically trigger. Expect agricultural regions to keep absorbing crop losses as growing seasons face longer stretches of extreme heat stress at exactly the wrong moments in the growing cycle. And expect the true death toll, whatever the final official number turns out to be each year, to remain an undercount, because the systems that record cause of death were never built to capture a killer this quiet, this dispersed, and this bureaucratically invisible. But expect something else too, because this story doesn't have to end purely as a warning. Cities are already beginning to adapt in ways that matter. Cooling centers are expanding. Some mayors are activating heat emergency plans with the same urgency once reserved for blizzards. Utilities are being forced, summer after summer, to confront just how thin their operating margins have become, which is at least forcing overdue investment conversations about grid modernization. And the policy proposal to finally classify extreme heat as a federally recognized disaster is sitting in front of Congress right now, waiting for the political will to catch up to the physical reality. Because in the end, that is the real story hiding underneath every scorched thermometer reading, every emergency grid alert, every quiet obituary that never mentions the word heat at all. America is not simply facing a hotter climate. America is facing the uncomfortable truth that its entire infrastructure, its power grids, its emergency response laws, its hospitals, its transportation networks, even its cause of death paperwork, was built for a world that no longer exists. The heat isn't the anomaly anymore. The systems pretending it is are, and somewhere right now in a city you've never thought twice about, in an apartment with no air conditioning on a night that will never cool below 80 degrees, someone's heart is working just a little too hard to keep up. Whether the country builds the systems to protect that person before next summer arrives, or waits for the numbers to force its hand once again, may end up being one of the defining questions of the decade to come. Stay curious. Stay ahead of what we don't know yet.